Hello and welcome to Padriff. Today we're going to talk about how scooters became so popular in the country. And remember, just before the pandemic hit, 1 in 3 two-wheelers sold in the country was a scooter. And this comes from the background of the situation where in the late 90s, the number of scooters being sold in the country were zero. There were no scooters on sale at all as the Chetak faded out and there was nothing to replace it. So what happened? Now the story goes that when Honda came to India early in the 2000s and they were told that they could only make scooters as per their agreement with Hero as the company split into their own functions, the restriction that was put on Honda was that they could only make scooters for a number of years before they could introduce motorcycles. Now a lot of people were very worried for Honda back then, and there is a quote ascribed to the Honda senior management at the time which said, "Anybody who thinks India is a motorcycle country does not understand how the Indian two-wheeler market works." And over time actually Honda's proved that they were right on the ball, because today a large part of what they sell is the Activa and its derivatives and variants, and it's literally the centerpiece of how Honda has operated. So why did scooters suddenly become so relevant to the country, and why was the sales at zero in the beginning of the 2000s? The reason is actually quite simple. The scooter market was heavily dominated by the Bajaj Chetak for a long time. And at the end of the 90s, there were a lot of motorcycles and a lot of options for buyers, but there weren't that many scooters. And worse, when the Activa did come into the market, the difference in fuel economy between scooters and motorcycles was actually quite a bit. You could easily get a number of motorcycles that will give you 65-70 kilometers to the liter, but the scooters were generally doing about 40 kilometers, and that was a big difference for us to deal with. But also remember that scooters were harder to ride in India at this point because our roads were worse. Scooters by nature have smaller wheels, and smaller wheels generally equates to bad ride quality. The bigger the bump, the bigger the wheel I need to absorb it with the least discomfort to me. So an 18-inch wheel hitting the same bump will have a much less effect on the rider than a 10-inch wheel. And in fact, if you notice what's happened, over the years, we finally got 12-inch wheel scooters and even a couple of 14-inch wheel scooters. Indians typically shy away from scooters with 15 and 16-inch wheels, although they're quite common in Europe, because that format looks to us like a moped. And once it looks to a moped, our brain does a two-step process. The first step is, oh, that's a moped, and the second step is, I don't want one. So majority of the scooters remain 10-inch wheeled, 12-inch wheeled, but our roads have gotten better, which means the scooter's job at absorbing the bumps has become easier, which means you can ride your scooters in more places in India with every passing year. The second thing that happened to India is that our cities became bigger and urbanized India became a larger unit, and nuclear families happened to us. Now remember, in a nuclear family, it is quite logical for you to think that a 100cc or a 125cc motorcycle would be your first purchase. But think about it. Usually in India, because of the way women dress, saris and all, motorcycles are much harder to use. So as nuclear families happened, it became easier for the wives to convince the husbands that the motorcycle could wait and the scooter would be a more logical first purchase. Simultaneously, scooter manufacturers also realized that fuel economy was a big deal, and pushing the fuel economy would immediately bring sales. And look at it today, a lot of scooters regularly offer 60 kilometers per liter, which is considered not as good as motorcycles, but it's a hygiene number. And if you can get it to 60, a lot of people are willing to buy a product. And that's how the legacy of scooters was created. Now there are manufacturers like Bajaj who refuse to participate in the scooter market. But look at it the other way, Aprilia and Piaggio still don't make any motorcycles. They are a large chunk of what TVS sells in India. They are the largest chunk of what Suzuki sells in India. And Honda's fortunes today are built entirely on the shoulders of their scooters. And in fact, Hero, who are not known for their scooters, even in the scooter list, the Hero Pleasure is among the highest selling scooters. So what has changed in the more recent past is actually quite interesting, because as the pandemic hit, scooter sales took a far bigger hit than motorcycles. And a lot of people are saying this is for two reasons. One, motorcycles are generally much cheaper to buy, so the entry point into the motorcycle market is lower than scooters. So a lot of the rural purchases that would have been scooters converted to motorcycles simply because people wanted to save money. And two, the government has slowly been raising the prices of fuel, and this has not helped scooters at all, because today you do have scooters that return 60 kilometers per liter, but you do have motorcycles that are easy to buy and they offer 90 to 100 kilometers per liter, at least under standard test conditions. That doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's a reversing of a trend that has started in the early 2000s and continued unabated, where scooters began from zero and grew to becoming almost 33% of the Indian motorcycle market. Now, if you look outside India, there are lots of examples of markets where the shift was dramatic and even overnight. Why does this happen? If you look at our cities, As the cities become larger but the roads become better, the scooters become more relevant because they're just more practical than motorcycles. Also remember, scooters are slightly more expensive to make than the average motorcycle, so it is a bigger investment for the manufacturer to actually make a scooter than a motorcycle. But when you have small families trying to share a vehicle, scooters play a far larger and more useful role than motorcycles, and that's been the centerpiece of why scooters became so popular in the country. So what happens next? Now, once the pandemic goes away, fuel prices will probably not come down anytime soon. That's not what it looks like, especially given the fact that the largest chunk of what you pay when you buy petrol is taxes. In that scenario, unless the scooter manufacturers can bring more fuel economy to the table, chances are the motorcycle domination will continue and the scooter growth will slow a little bit. But the flip side, and I'm really excited about this, is that we are finally breaking out of the 100-110cc continuum and we are looking at larger scooters ever more seriously. So far, Aprilia and Piaggio have been the only two manufacturers constantly pushing the cc limit, but I think bigger scooters are coming, and even more exciting, serious electric scooters are also on the way. There are rumors that people like Honda and Suzuki are working on serious electric scooters, not your 45 kmph jobs, that will take on the job of expanding the scooter market further. What kind of scooters do you think we should get in India? Do leave us a comment, and which is your favorite scooter in India, not counting the Activa? Do leave us a comment as well. Thank you so much for watching. This is Powerdrift. We've stayed safe through the lockdown and emerged stronger. We hope you're trying to get yourself vaccinated. A lot of our team members have, and it does allow us at least a measure of peace and safety for our families, if nothing else, and therefore we encourage you to try and get it as well. Thank you so much for watching. This is Powerdrift.